On the evening of November 4th, 1988, a National Security Agency analyst at Fort Meade, Maryland, flagged a letter that had been intercepted from a residential address in Mount Vernon, New York. The letter, written in German and addressed to East Germany, appeared unremarkable on its surface, a brief note about family matters, but the analyst noticed linguistic patterns that seemed inconsistent with natural family correspondence. The phrasing was too formal, too careful, suggesting the writer was not a native German speaker, despite the fluent grammar. The letter had been sent by Jack Barsky, a 39-year-old computer programmer who lived in a modest apartment in Mount Vernon with his partner and their 6-year-old daughter. According to public records, Barsky had been living in the United States since the late 1970s. He worked at a telecommunications company, paid his taxes, belonged to a gym, and led what appeared to be an entirely ordinary suburban life. The NSA analyst who flagged the letter had been trained to recognize signs of coded communication. While the letter contained no obvious cipher, the unnatural phrasing suggested it might be what intelligence professionals call an accommodation address letter, a method used by Soviet intelligence officers to communicate with handlers using prearranged signals embedded in seemingly innocent correspondence. The letter was forwarded to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division in New York. Within days, analysts began pulling together every available piece of information about Jack Barsky. What they found was a life that appeared entirely ordinary on the surface, but that began to reveal inconsistencies when examined more closely. Employment records before 1978 were difficult to verify. Educational credentials listed on job applications could not be confirmed through the institutions he claimed to have attended. There were no childhood friends or family members who could be located. The paper trail of Jack Barsky's existence seemed to begin abruptly in the late 1970s, with very little documentation before that point. A deeper search of vital records revealed something more troubling. There was a birth certificate for Jack Barsky, born in New Jersey in 1949. There was also a death certificate for an infant named Jack Barsky, who had died in 1950 at 10 months old. The birth certificate and death certificate matched. Same parents, same date of birth. But somehow, nearly 30 years after this infant's death, a man using that name had been living and working in the United States, had obtained a Social Security number, had filed tax returns, had built what appeared to be a normal American life. The FBI opened a preliminary investigation in late 1988. The case was assigned to the New York Field Office's Counterintelligence Squad, which specialized in identifying and monitoring foreign intelligence officers operating on American soil. The initial assessment was that Jack Barsky was likely a KGB illegal, a deep-cover intelligence officer living under a false identity, possibly deployed years earlier and instructed to build a sustainable cover life before undertaking any actual intelligence collection. Before we continue with how this operation unraveled and the extraordinary human story behind it, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. The man living as Jack Barsky was actually Albrecht Dittrich, born on October 18, 1949, in the East German city of Jena. His father had worked as a chemical engineer at a factory that produced optical instruments. His mother had been a school teacher. According to Dittrich's later accounts in his memoir and public interviews, his childhood in post-war East Germany had been marked by the material shortages and ideological rigidity typical of Soviet bloc countries during that era, but also by opportunities for intellectually gifted students who showed loyalty to the socialist system. Dittrich had excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and chemistry. In 1968, at age 18, he had been admitted to Friedrich Schiller University in Jena to study chemistry. The university was one of East Germany's most prestigious institutions and had a reputation for producing scientists who would serve the needs of the German Democratic Republic and the broader Warsaw Pact. It was during his university years that Dittrich first came to the attention of Soviet intelligence. According to his later testimony, he was approached in 1970 by a professor who suggested he might be suited for special work that would allow him to serve not just East Germany, but the broader socialist movement. The recruitment process was gradual and psychologically sophisticated. Dittrich was invited to informal discussions about political theory, international relations, and the role of intelligence work in protecting socialist states from Western aggression. He was assessed not just for intellectual capabilities, but for psychological resilience, his ability to withstand isolation, to maintain deception over long periods, to operate independently without direct supervision. By 1973, Dittrich had been formally recruited by the KGB and had begun preliminary training while completing his chemistry degree. After graduating, he was sent to Moscow for intensive preparation for what Soviet intelligence called special assignment work, the deployment of illegal officers to live under deep cover in Western countries for years or decades. The training Dittrich received between 1973 and 1978 was designed to transform him into someone who could plausibly pass as an American. He studied at a KGB facility outside Moscow where instructors, some of them former illegals who had operated in the United States, taught him American English with meticulous attention to idioms, regional variations, and cultural references. He studied American history, popular culture, geography, and social customs. He watched American films and television programs. He read American newspapers and magazines. He learned to think in American terms, to understand American preoccupations, to respond to situations the way an American would respond. The training emphasized patience and discipline. Illegal officers were expected to establish themselves in their target countries for years before undertaking actual intelligence collection. The priority was to become invisible, to build a life that would withstand scrutiny, to create a believable existence that could serve as a platform for long-term operations. Dittrich was taught tradecraft, how to establish and maintain cover identities, how to communicate securely with Moscow Center using coded messages and dead drops, how to avoid surveillance, how to assess and recruit potential intelligence sources, how to photograph documents, and how to recognize when an operation had been compromised. Central to Dittrich's preparation was the creation of his American identity. The KGB had developed sophisticated methods for constructing false identities that could withstand background checks and routine investigation. One common technique was to identify real American citizens who had died young, often in infancy or childhood, and to assume their identities. Death records would have been filed but might not have been cross-referenced with other government databases, particularly if the death had occurred decades earlier. Using this deceased infant's identity, Soviet intelligence had obtained authentic birth documentation and built supporting materials around it: Social Security number applications, driver's license records, and other identity documents that could establish Jack Barsky as a real person with a verifiable past. In October 1978, Albrecht Dittrich, now carrying documentation identifying him as Jack Philip Barsky, entered the United States. According to his later accounts, he had traveled first to Canada and had then made his way to the United States through a border crossing. His instructions from Moscow Center had been explicit: establish yourself, build a life, blend in completely. There would be no intelligence assignments immediately. The first phase of the operation would last several years and would focus entirely on creating a sustainable cover existence. Barsky settled in Queens, New York, renting a small apartment. He took a job as a computer programmer, a profession chosen strategically because it was a growing field with demand for workers who had technical skills. It was also work that could be done relatively independently, where social interactions were often limited, and where questions about one's background or personal history were less likely to arise in casual workplace conversation. Barsky proved genuinely skilled at computer programming. He had a mathematical mind and an aptitude for the logical structures of code. He worked competently, kept regular hours, and developed cordial but not particularly close relationships with coworkers. He joined a gym and began working out regularly. He attended occasional social events where he presented himself as quiet but friendly, someone who was pleasant enough but not particularly memorable. According to his later testimony, Barsky's life during these early years in the United States was characterized by profound loneliness. He was living alone in a foreign country under a false identity, forbidden from forming genuinely close relationships, unable to share his real background or his actual thoughts about his situation with anyone. He spent evenings in his apartment writing reports in cipher that he would later transmit to Moscow Center through dead drops, maintaining his cover and managing the psychological burden of his double existence. In 1981, Barsky's situation changed when he met a woman at a social gathering. She was outgoing and friendly, and she found Barsky, quiet and serious, with his slight accent, interesting and attractive. They began dating, and within months, their relationship had become serious. The relationship presented Barsky with a dilemma. His instructions from Moscow Center had emphasized avoiding deep personal entanglements that could complicate his cover or create vulnerabilities. At the same time, a serious relationship could enhance his cover by making him appear more settled and normal, less likely to attract suspicion as someone living in isolation. Barsky made the decision to continue the relationship, rationalizing that it strengthened his cover. When he eventually reported the relationship to his handlers through coded communications, the response was neither explicit approval nor disapproval, but a reminder to prioritize the security of his cover above all other considerations. In 1982, his partner became pregnant. This development forced Barsky to confront the full implications of the life he was living. He was about to become a father to a child who would never know his real identity, who would grow up believing her father was Jack Barsky, an American computer programmer. He would have to maintain his deception not just in public, but within his own household, in the most intimate relationships of his life. Their daughter was born in 1983. According to Barsky's later accounts, becoming a father created an emotional attachment he had not fully anticipated. He loved his daughter in a way that made his double life increasingly difficult to sustain psychologically. He began to experience what he would later describe as internal splitting. Part of him was Albrecht Dittrich, the KGB officer carrying out a long-term assignment, and part of him was Jack Barsky, a father and partner building a family in suburban New York. Throughout the 1980s, Barsky continued to operate as a KGB illegal. Though his actual intelligence work remained relatively limited, he received assignments through coded messages delivered via dead drops in various locations around New York and New Jersey. These assignments were typically what intelligence professionals call spotting and assessing, identifying individuals who worked in positions that might provide access to valuable information and evaluating whether they might be susceptible to recruitment. Barsky would attend professional conferences, strike up conversations with people who worked in technology or defense-related fields, and write detailed reports about these individuals that he would transmit back to Moscow Center. The work was not glamorous or dramatic. Most of it involved patience, routine, and meticulous attention to maintaining his cover. Barsky lived a double life, where the most important rule was to appear completely ordinary. He paid his taxes, maintained his apartment, went to work every day, participated in his daughter's life, and did nothing that would make anyone, neighbors, co-workers, family, look at him twice. When the FBI opened its investigation in late 1988, following the interception of Barsky's coded letter, the initial surveillance was careful and limited, designed to avoid alerting him to any official interest. Agents documented his daily routines, his commute to work, his weekend activities with his family, his visits to the gym. They photographed him from a distance. They monitored his financial transactions for unusual patterns. They checked for contacts he might have with known or suspected intelligence officers. For months, the surveillance produced nothing obviously suspicious. Barsky appeared to live exactly the kind of ordinary life his documentation suggested. He went to work, came home, spent time with his daughter, ran errands, watched television. There were no obvious secret meetings, no visits to known dead-drop locations, no contacts with Soviet diplomatic personnel. Then, in early 1989, agents conducting surveillance observed Barsky engaging in behavior that suggested counter-surveillance awareness. On a Saturday afternoon, according to FBI surveillance reports, he drove a route through residential neighborhoods that seemed designed to detect if he was being followed, making sudden turns without signaling, driving slowly while appearing to watch his mirrors, periodically pulling over and waiting before continuing. To trained FBI surveillance agents, this behavior suggested someone checking to see if they were being followed. After approximately 30 minutes of this driving, Barsky parked at a shopping center and went into a bookstore, where he spent time browsing but purchased nothing. He then drove to a park and began walking along a trail. FBI agents followed at a distance and, according to surveillance reports, observed him stop at a tree where he appeared to retrieve something from a hollow at the base of the trunk. He placed the object in his jacket pocket and continued walking. The FBI agents did not approach or attempt to recover whatever Barsky had retrieved. Instead, they documented the location and continued surveillance. After Barsky had left the park and returned home, agents examined the area. They found evidence suggesting the location had been used multiple times for similar purposes. The dirt was compressed in a way that indicated objects had been placed there and removed repeatedly. This observation transformed the FBI's assessment. Barsky was not just someone with a suspicious background, he was someone actively engaged in tradecraft consistent with intelligence operations. The dead drop activity was a classic espionage technique. The FBI expanded its investigation, obtaining authorization for more intensive surveillance and monitoring. Over the following years, from 1989 through 1996, the FBI maintained systematic observation of Barsky's activities. The decision was made not to arrest him immediately, but rather to conduct long-term surveillance that might reveal other intelligence assets or provide insights into KGB operational methods. During this extended surveillance period, the FBI documented several instances of what appeared to be intelligence-related activity: visits to potential dead-drop locations, apparent attempts to detect surveillance, and patterns of behavior that suggested he was maintaining contact with handlers, though the exact methods of communication were not always clear. By the mid-1990s, the geopolitical landscape had transformed dramatically. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991. The KGB had been restructured. The Cold War had ended. Barsky was an illegal officer deployed by a country that no longer existed, operating within an intelligence framework that had been fundamentally disrupted. The FBI's counterintelligence leadership made a strategic decision. Rather than immediately arresting Barsky and prosecuting him for espionage-related offenses, they would approach him and attempt to secure his cooperation. The reasoning was that Barsky's intelligence value as a source of information about KGB illegal programs might exceed any benefit that would come from prosecution, particularly given that the Soviet Union no longer existed, and the strategic context had changed. In 1997, nearly 9 years after the FBI had first identified Barsky as a probable KGB illegal, 2 agents approached him. The confrontation occurred not at his home, but at a location where Barsky would be alone and where the conversation could be conducted privately. According to later accounts, the agents identified themselves and informed Barsky that they knew his real identity. They said they had evidence he was not who he claimed to be. They said they knew his real name was Albrecht Dittrich, that he had entered the United States under a false identity created using the birth certificate of a deceased infant, and that he had been trained by the KGB and deployed as an illegal intelligence officer. Barsky's initial response was to deny the allegations, but as the agents presented specific details, information about his training, references to surveillance observations over the previous 9 years, descriptions of his activities, his resistance weakened. The agents explained that he faced a choice. He could refuse to cooperate, in which case he would be arrested and would likely face serious criminal charges. Or he could cooperate fully with the FBI's investigation, provide detailed information about his background and activities, and potentially avoid prosecution. The agents also made clear that they were aware of his daughter. They knew he had built a life with his partner. They understood that he had formed attachments that complicated his situation. If he chose to cooperate, there might be possibilities for him to remain in the United States under certain conditions, though nothing could be guaranteed without full cooperation first. According to Barsky's later accounts, the decision was agonizing. He was faced with a choice between maintaining loyalty to an intelligence service that served a country that no longer existed, or choosing his relationship with his daughter and the life he had built over the previous 19 years. The ideology he had originally served, the Soviet system he had believed was creating a better world, had collapsed. Of consideration, Barsky agreed to cooperate. Between 1997 and 2000, he participated in extensive debriefing sessions with the FBI and other U.S. intelligence agencies. He provided detailed information about KGB illegal officer programs, training methods at the Moscow facility where he had been prepared, recruitment techniques used to identify and cultivate potential illegals, operational procedures for maintaining cover identities, methods for communicating with handlers through dead drops and coded messages, and the specific assignments he had received during his years in the United States. The FBI's assessment, based on Barsky's cooperation and their own investigation of his activities, was that he had been what they classified as a sleeper agent, an illegal officer who had established deep cover but who had engaged in relatively limited actual intelligence collection. Most of his activities had been infrastructure development, establishing his cover identity, building credibility, creating networks of contacts that might someday be useful for intelligence purposes. The information he had provided to Moscow Center over the years had consisted primarily of open-source material and assessments of individuals he had been asked to spot and evaluate. He had never successfully recruited any American citizens as intelligence sources and had never obtained classified information from government or defense industry sources. The FBI made a decision that was controversial within the intelligence community. Rather than prosecuting Barsky, they would allow him to remain in the United States in exchange for his continued cooperation and his agreement to certain restrictions. Several factors influenced this decision. First, Barsky's cooperation had provided valuable intelligence about KGB operational methods that could help the FBI identify other illegals who might still be operating in the United States. Second, the Cold War had ended, and the strategic value of prosecuting a former Soviet illegal was diminished compared to earlier periods. Third, the FBI had never caught Barsky in the act of transmitting classified information. His activities had been primarily preparatory rather than involving actual espionage against specific classified programs. Barsky was allowed to remain in the United States as a legal permanent resident. He was required to maintain contact with FBI handlers to report any attempts by foreign intelligence services to contact him, and to agree not to engage in any activities that could compromise U.S. national security. He eventually obtained U.S. citizenship, legally changed his name to Jack Barsky, and began building a new life, or perhaps more accurately, continued the life he had been building, but now without the burden of maintaining a false identity for intelligence purposes. The impact on his personal life was devastating. His partner, who had known him as Jack Barsky throughout their relationship, learned the truth about his identity during the FBI's investigation. According to later accounts, she was profoundly shaken by the revelation. The man she had been in a relationship with for more than 15 years, the father of her daughter, was not who he had claimed to be. His entire background was fabricated. His accent, which she had attributed to family background somewhere in Europe, was actually his imperfect mastery of American English after growing up speaking German. She struggled with whether to continue the relationship. She felt betrayed on a fundamental level. At the same time, she had built a life with this man, and they had a daughter together. The person she had known as Jack Barsky. His personality, his behavior as a father, his day-to-day presence in her life, had been real, even if his identity had been false. Ultimately, she decided to end their romantic relationship, though she maintained contact for their daughter's sake. They separated in the late 1990s. Their daughter, who was a teenager at the time, did not immediately understand the full truth about her father's past. She was told that her parents were separating because of problems in their relationship, but the detailed information about her father's background as a KGB illegal was withheld initially to protect her. Barsky moved into a small apartment and found work as a computer consultant. He lived quietly, meeting his obligations to the FBI, maintaining a relationship with his daughter through regular visits, and gradually adjusting to a life where he was no longer maintaining a cover identity for intelligence purposes, but was instead living openly as someone who had once been a spy. Over the following years, as his daughter grew into adulthood, Barsky gradually shared more information about his background. He explained that he had been born in East Germany, that he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence as a young man, that he had spent years living under a false identity, and that he had been discovered by the FBI and had chosen to cooperate rather than face prosecution or attempt to flee. According to later accounts from both Barsky and his daughter, she struggled to integrate this information into her understanding of her father. The man she knew, who had helped her with homework, taken her to the movies, been present and loving throughout her childhood, seemed disconnected from the story of a Soviet spy living a double life. She experienced anger at the deception, confusion about what parts of her childhood had been real, and a complicated mix of emotions about her father's choices and their impact on her life. In the early 2000s, Barsky began speaking publicly about his experiences. He gave interviews to journalists and intelligence professionals, participated in conferences about counterintelligence and espionage, and eventually wrote a memoir titled Deep Undercover, published in 2017, which detailed his experiences as a KGB illegal and his subsequent cooperation with the FBI. His willingness to discuss his past publicly was motivated by several factors. He wanted to help intelligence and security professionals understand how illegal officer programs worked, believing that sharing his experiences could contribute to better counterintelligence practices. He also seemed to need to make sense of his own life and the choices he had made, and the process of explaining his experiences to others helped him develop a coherent narrative about his own past. In interviews and in his memoir, Barsky reflected extensively on the psychological burden of living under deep cover for nearly 2 decades. He described the experience as one of constant performance, always monitoring his own behavior, always maintaining a facade, never able to fully relax or be himself, because himself was supposed to be someone else. He spoke about the loneliness of maintaining secrets from everyone around him, including people he genuinely cared about. He acknowledged the profound psychological toll of internal division, living as 2 people simultaneously, neither of whom could be fully authentic. When asked about his motivations for becoming a spy, Barsky's answers revealed considerable self-examination. He acknowledged that while he had initially emphasized ideological commitment, believing in socialism and viewing his work as serving the goal of preventing war between the superpowers, his motivations had been more complex than that simple narrative suggested. He had been young and had been flattered by the attention of sophisticated intelligence officers who treated him as valuable and special. He had enjoyed the adventure and the intellectual challenge. He had not fully thought through the implications of what he was agreeing to do, or the human cost his choices would impose on others. Regarding his decision to cooperate with the FBI, Barsky was straightforward. The primary motivation had been his relationship with his daughter. The thought of being imprisoned for decades and missing the remainder of her childhood and her adult life had been unbearable. He had also recognized that by the late 1990s, the ideological framework that had justified his espionage no longer existed. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the Cold War had ended, and protecting Soviet intelligence operations seemed pointless. For his partner and daughter, the long-term impact of Barsky's deception was profound and lasting. His former partner rarely spoke publicly about the relationship and declined most interview requests. According to people who knew her, she struggled for years with feelings of having been fundamentally deceived about a relationship that had lasted more than 15 years and that had produced her daughter. His daughter, as she grew into adulthood, developed a complicated relationship with her father's past. In interviews she gave as an adult, she described feeling caught between competing narratives, one in which her father was a foreign spy who had lied to everyone, including her mother, and another in which her father was someone who had made choices when he was young, had lived with those choices for years, and had ultimately chosen his family over his espionage career when forced to make that decision. The broader significance of the Barsky case extended beyond the individual story. It illustrated the methods Soviet intelligence had used during the Cold War to place illegal officers in the United States, the use of deceased infant identities, the extensive training in language and culture, the patient development of cover identities over years or decades. It demonstrated the vulnerabilities that arose as record-keeping systems became more sophisticated and integrated, making it harder to sustain false identities that could withstand cross-referencing and verification. The case also revealed the human complexities that emerged when intelligence operations intersected with ordinary life. Barsky had been deployed as an intelligence officer with clear objectives and professional obligations, but he had also built genuine relationships, become a father, developed attachments and emotions that were real even if the identity under which he experienced them was fabricated. When his cover was compromised, he faced choices that intelligence training had not prepared him for. Choices between loyalty to an intelligence service and loyalty to a family, between ideology and human connection, between the identity he had been assigned and the life he had actually lived. The question of moral responsibility in cases like Barsky's involves multiple layers of complexity. Barsky made choices. He chose to be recruited by the KGB, chose to enter the United States under false pretenses, chose to maintain his deception for nearly 20 years, chose to build a family while living a double life, chose to cooperate with the FBI when confronted. Each of these choices reflected his agency and his values at different moments in his life, but those choices were made within contexts that shaped what options seemed available and what rationalizations seemed plausible. The KGB officers who recruited him made choices about how to deploy human assets. The political leaders who directed intelligence operations made choices about what methods were acceptable in service of state interests. The individuals who designed false identity systems made choices about what level of deception was permissible. All of these choices created contexts in which Barsky's individual choices became possible and, from certain perspectives, logical. The victims in the Barsky case included people with varying levels of agency. His partner had entered a relationship and had a child with someone who was fundamentally lying to her about his identity. She was deceived in ways that affected the most intimate aspects of her life, and she bore no responsibility for this deception. His daughter was born into a situation she had no control over, with a father whose past and identity were not what they appeared to be. Even Barsky himself could be understood as, in some ways, shaped by the system that recruited him, a young man in his early 20s who had been ideologically influenced and professionally trained to undertake work whose full human implications he likely did not understand until he had been living them for years. This does not absolve him of responsibility for his choices, but it acknowledges that responsibility exists within layers of context and constraint. The case raises profound questions about identity itself, what it means, how it is constructed, how it can be performed and maintained over decades. For nearly 20 years, Albrecht Dittrich lived as Jack Barsky, performing American identity so thoroughly that he became, in many fundamental ways, American. He thought in English, participated in American culture, raised an American daughter, lived an American life. The philosophical question emerges, at what point does a performed identity become, in some sense, real? At what point does the person wearing the mask become indistinguishable from the mask itself? And when that happens, which version represents the authentic self? Barsky's later reflections suggested he himself struggled with these questions throughout his post-exposure life. When he eventually legalized his name change and became officially Jack Barsky, he was making a choice about which identity felt more authentic to him. Not the identity he had been born with in East Germany, but the identity he had lived for most of his adult life, even if it had initially been imposed on him as cover for intelligence operations. The coded letter that an NSA analyst flagged in 1988, the small linguistic irregularity in what appeared to be routine family correspondence, had been one piece of evidence in a much larger investigation. Combined with systematic analysis of identity documents, with intelligence sharing between U.S. and German authorities following the fall of the Berlin Wall, with FBI surveillance operations conducted over 9 years, and with Barsky's own decision to cooperate when confronted, it produced an outcome where a KGB illegal who had operated successfully for nearly 2 decades was identified, debriefed, and ultimately allowed to remain in the United States under terms that prioritized intelligence value over punitive prosecution. The case stands as one example among many from the Cold War era of how intelligence operations intersected with ordinary lives, creating situations where people made choices under extraordinary circumstances, where systems shaped individual decisions, where ideology collided with human attachment, and where consequences rippled outward to affect people who had little or no agency in the situation. Jack Barsky was 39 years old when the FBI first identified him in 1988. He was 48 when the FBI confronted him in 1997. He is, as of this writing, in his mid-70s, living in the United States under his chosen name, having spent more years as Jack Barsky than he ever spent as Albrecht Dittrich. The identity that began as cover, constructed from the birth certificate of an infant who died in 1950, trained in Moscow in the 1970s, deployed to Queens in 1978, became, over time and through lived experience, the identity he chose to keep and to make legally his own. Whether that transformation represented redemption, pragmatism, psychological necessity, or simply the natural evolution of a human being across decades, is a question that perhaps cannot be answered definitively and may have different answers depending on who is asking and from what perspective they view the story. What remains certain is that the man who entered the United States in 1978 as a KGB illegal, who built a cover life that became a real life, who was discovered partly because of linguistic patterns in a coded letter, lived through the collapse of the system that had trained and deployed him, chose his daughter over his handlers when forced to make that choice, and remained in the country he had been sent to spy on, living, in the end, the very identity he had once only performed.